It all started on the 14th of November 1998. 9-year-old Matthew Cecchi, who was very close to his 10th birthday, was enjoying a family vacation at Oceanside, California, along with his mum and brother, who were also there for a family reunion with the grandparents, aunts, uncles, and Matthew's cousins. Matthew's father, who was suffering from a serious illness, stayed at the family home in Oroville. So it was on this day of the 14th, Matthew, a third grader, joined his family for a picture. It looked like a lovely sunny day and everybody looked happy. After about 5 minutes of the picture being taken, Matthew's mother called her son over and asked him what would he do if he was approached by a stranger. Matthew replied that he would scream. And I feel this is what any typical mother would do. That is, to reiterate about stranger danger, especially when you're in a new area. Nobody could have possibly anticipated what would have happened in a short space of time in this beautiful little seaside town. That would be so tragic, I found it hard to comprehend how from one minute everything was fine to the next your life is turned upside down. Because after his mum had this conversation with Matthew, he then wanted to join his cousins at the park, which was a matter of metres away, with Aunt Gail watching over all the children playing happily, unaware someone else would also be watching. Because it just so happens this very same day, a young man called Brandon Wilson had stayed overnight at a hotel, which was also at Oceanside. Now, nobody knows why Brandon had decided on Oceanside as the place for him to stay, but Brandon had left his home in Ohio on a quest to find God. He caught a Greyhound bus and decided to camp at Borrego Springs, which is a good couple of hours away from Oceanside. The 13th of November, Brandon checks in at the hotel at Oceanside. All this time, Brandon believes that God is talking to him and telling him to kill someone. And all through the night, Brandon played out this fantasy in his head. Now, this fantasy of killing someone was one that had been brooding for quite a while, so before he had left Ohio. So through the night, Brandon plans to attack a woman, and decides that the beach would be the best place for it. So on the morning of the 14th of November, Brandon sets off along the road, and he reaches one end of the beach. He notices a woman, and as he stares at her like prey, she actually notices him staring. She stares him down, and Brandon changes his mind. Brandon, being quite a small, thin guy, wasn't really a match for someone who was bigger than him. So in his mind, she would be too much to control. As he carries on walking along the beach, he sees another potential victim. This was a 17-year-old girl who luckily saw Brandon and had a gut feeling that something wasn't right, so she takes off fast in the other direction. This just goes to show that you should always trust your instinct. Now, Brandon had 2 failed attempts of attacking a woman. This is now when Brandon walks much further up the beach to where he can see kids playing at the park. Now he starts stalking a victim. He can see another adult nearby watching over these kids, so he hid himself out of the way and sits nearby a restroom. Meanwhile, Matthew and his cousins are all playing in the park, when he suddenly shouts over to his Aunt Gail that he needs to go to the restroom. Now, if I've got this right, Matthew had taken off without his shoes and socks, because he had been playing in the Sandy Park area. This is when Aunt Gail immediately calls after him to put the shoes on, but Matthew is already running towards the restroom and enters through the door, not knowing that a predator is literally a couple of steps behind him. Aunt Gail, meanwhile, has just reached the restroom area, calling out Matthew's name, but she got no answer. She calls out a couple more times, but when there was still no answer, Aunt Gail went to take a step towards the male restroom door, when suddenly Brandon Wilson came out through the door in a manic rush and shouts, "What's going on?" at Aunt Gail. Brandon then takes off running along the road. Aunt Gail runs into the restroom and is shocked to see her young nephew on the floor in a pool of blood. Chaos ensues as Aunt Gail's screams alert the other family members and onlookers. As she's screaming for help, she's also pointing towards where she can still see Brandon running along the road. Everybody is trying to help stem the flow of blood to Matthew's neck, which had been slashed by a knife, but to no avail. Police were called, and luckily they were close by, so much so that Brandon could see them coming along the road. Brandon ducks down behind a car as they pass him. As soon as they pass him, Brandon carries on running and finds a culvert to hide. The police spring into action by clearing everyone out of the bathroom, and they set up a perimeter and immediately searching for the young male that Aunt Gail has described to the police. Meanwhile, Brandon, who is still hiding in the culvert, could see the cops getting closer to where he was hiding. And little did the cops know that Brandon, who was watching them, the cops totally unaware, was ready to kill if they had got any closer. As you can imagine, the scene was chaotic, and before long, the news media turned up, all parking in the car park. Brandon Wilson manages to make his way back to his hotel for the night, and one of the first things the investigators did was to get the names of everyone in the hotels in the area. The next day, Brandon checks out of his hotel and gets his head shaved. The next thing he does is boards a Greyhound bus and travels to Hollywood, all the time fantasizing about killing another person. When he gets off the bus, he comes across another woman who is walking alone. He attacks her by stabbing her many times. She manages to fight him off and flees. However, the neighbourhood he did it in, residents responded quickly and chased Brandon down and beat him into submission and held on to him until the police came. He gets arrested for attempted murder, and it was when he was being interrogated by the LAPD that he alluded to the crime in Oceanside, even letting them know where he had stabbed Matthew. It was then that the Oceanside police came down to question Brandon. It wasn't long before Brandon confessed to the murder of Matthew, demonstrating to the investigators how he did it. Which was when he walked in behind Matthew, he sees him going to the toilet, and Matthew turns round. Brandon smiled at him, and then he attacked him by stabbing poor Matthew as this happened. Brandon could hear someone call Matthew's name from outside. He initially thinks he'll go out and kill that person, who he actually thought was Matthew's mother. But as he leaves to go outside, he decided not to attack the lady outside and makes a run for it. So between the confession, blood transfer that had been forensically tested which linked Brandon to Matthew's murder, at the trial he pleaded guilty, and in the same plea pleads not guilty, for reasons of insanity. Not forgetting he still has the attempted murder charge in Hollywood that he still has to face. He waived his right for preliminary hearing and goes straight to trial. In the court, he actually shouts in front of everyone that he killed Matthew and that he would kill him again. This man is pure evil. Brandon decides to go on the stand, and he's declared sane. When he goes on the stand, he says what he wants to say, which is basically that he has no remorse, and ends it with, "Execute me." He is sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin. But I'm not sure if the sentence included the attempted murder charge in Hollywood. On the 17th of November 2011, Brandon Wilson hung himself.